Now, if you've followed me for a while, you will know how much I love making gum paste flowers. So for this week's video tutorial, I thought I would add to the collection and show you how to make these really pretty gum paste orchids to add onto your cakes. Also, don't forget that if you enjoy the video tutorial, you can subscribe to the Cakes by Nature YouTube channel. You can also hit the notification bell next to the subscribe button, and this will just alert you every time I upload a new video. Okay, let's get started. So the things that we're going to need in order to make our orchid is, first of all, I've got my gum paste, or in this case it's the Squire's floral paste. I've also got a selection of orchid cutters and just some generic petal veiners, some lengths of wire. Now I've cut my wire, which is a 24 gauge wire, and it's also covered in this white floral tape. I've cut it down to lengths of around 5 inches. I've then got my floral tape, my PME veining mat, and my foam board. I've got my rolling pin and some modeling tools, including my craft knife and a selection of paintbrushes. I've got some wire tools, some dipping solution that I'll use alongside some petal dust, some edible glue, and you want something to lay your petals in as they're drying. So you might have a flower former, or I'm going to be using some tin foil. Now, one thing I'm also going to be using is my kitchen blowtorch. If you don't have one of these, that's absolutely fine. You can just use edible glue. Now, the first thing I'm going to be starting with is creating just some little dishes for my petals to go into. So taking some pieces of tin foil or aluminium foil, laying it on the top of my glass and just lightly pushing my hand in to give me a kind of bowl shape. Now, the reason that I love using tin foil is you can change the shape of it as you lay your petal in. So I've got a few dishes, and the last one I'm gonna leave this on the top of my glass. Now, before I start my flower, I'm gonna prepare some of the tints that I'm gonna be using. All of my edible tints are by Sugar Flare. I've got a lemon yellow, a sunset orange, a small amount of violet and some pink, and a little bit of rose. So for the center of my flower, I've got my PME veining board, and as you can see, it's got these grooves cut out. I've also got a small ball of my white floral paste and this shaped cutter. So to start with, I'm going to take my ball and just roll the end between my fingers. Take this and place it on my veining board, but the bit we've pulled out, let hang off of my board. You then want to roll out your gum paste as thin as it will go. So as you can see, we've got this vein running along the back. And then just taking my slightly smaller rolling pin and just bringing out those edges so that when we go to cut it out, there's going to be enough gum paste on the side. Taking the top half of my cutter and placing it over the area where we've got this unflattened piece. I'm going to cut that out. On this top part, I'm going to thin that out slightly, just bringing it up, and with my fingers just run the bottom around so it's slightly thinner at the base, and it comes up into a slight point on the end. I can then use my ball tool or my Dresden tool just to help me curve that round, just pulling it back on itself. At the bottom, I'm going to cut up about 1 centimetre to separate that point. Now, bringing in my foam mat, use my ball tool, and first of all, just lengthen out those tails. So just using the larger ball tool, I can then use the smaller end, and going from the tip, pull those back into the centre. And you want to make sure they're separated. I'm just going to pull them in opposite directions. Now, using the larger ball tool again, thin out the edges of that bottom area, working from the center outwards, using the ball tool just to create a small amount of shape. Now, with these two circle bits that are sticking out, we want these eventually to curve round. I'm also going to thin out the edges, but I'm going to pull up and down just to widen them slightly, pushing that ball tool into the bottom, and as you can see, they'll start to cut round. You then want to take a really small ball of your white gum paste. So this one is around 4 millimeters across, and I'm going to roll that into an oval shape. Pinch my fingers on the back to hold that, and using my craft knife on the top, slice that into 2. On those edges, pull those out slightly and bring the 2 ends just into a point. I'm then going to use my Dresden tool, create a line and add in a small amount of edible glue. I can then take the part that I was holding and push this into that gap. Now, when the shape of this has been created and we've pulled it in and it's been left to dry, it's really hard to get the paintbrush in. So I find that because the gum paste is still slightly soft, it's the perfect time for me to add the colour. You just have to be really careful as it's really delicate. So first of all, taking some of that yellow, I'm going to add it to the edges of those triangle pieces, just coming up onto the edge, those circular parts. Now, moth orchids come in so many different varieties, so just have a look at pictures and decide where you want to add the colour. I'm then going to use that yellow just on the top of that separate piece we added and add some orange to the edges. Now, mixing some of the rose, the violet and the pink together, I'm going to just dust that where the top piece bends over and make sure that I go around the back as well. I then want to add some small details. So I'm taking again the rose and the violet, mixing those together and adding a bit of dipping solution to create a paint. Then got the finest paintbrush I could find. Starting on the piece that we added that we've coloured in yellow, add some tiny dots all over the top. Now on this back piece where we added the pink, I'm going to add some slightly larger marks. And then coming down onto the front, some really teeny tiny dots. Now on the side, these can either be full block colours or the one that I'm copying actually has some lines added. Now the next thing to do is shape it and leave it to dry. So I'm going to take a piece of my wire, create a really tiny loop at the top. Now you can dip this into edible glue, push it in and leave it to dry. I'm actually going to be using my blowtorch just to heat up the end. And all this does is just glues that into our gum paste. So I'm pushing that wire into the back of the piece that is coming forward. I can then bring in my glass and I'm going to point my wire slightly forward. So I want to use this front curve. I can then start to shape it. I want that front to come round and these two sides are gonna come in. So obviously you have to do the painting as quickly as possible so that your gum paste hasn't fully dried. You can then use pieces of tin foil or pieces of kitchen paper to hold those in place. And once you're happy with the shape, I'm gonna leave that to one side until it's completely dry. For the two main petals you're gonna see from the front, I've got some more of my Squire's floral paste. I've got a generic veining tool and some wires, also some edible glue and my cutter. Now when you get orchid cutters, the shape of this petal can differ slightly. Now this one is quite rounded, so I'm going to be using my rolling pin just to slightly stretch it out to give me a more natural shape. Taking a small ball of my gum paste, I'm going to again place it over the top of one of those ridges. So by using one of these veining mats, it just gives me a raised area on the back of my petal in order to push my wire into and cut that out. So we've got the wider area, the side of the petal with this point. Take my small rolling pin and just stretch out two sides. I'm then going to use my thumb just on that edge just to try and push it in slightly. I can then bring in my foam mat and my ball tool, run it around those edges, thinning them out slightly. Now we don't want to ruffle the edges, we just want to thin them out so it loses that blunt cut edge look. I can then take my edible glue and my wire, so pushing that wire into that raised area and then on the end just pinching that you know is secure. I'm then taking my veiner tool. Now you can get moth orchid veiners. I just want to add a slight texture onto there, so I'm just using one that I already have. Now these petals have a slight ridge running along the center, so where we've got that raised area, what I'm going to do is just pull my petal back on itself and then flatten it down just so we've got this slight ridge. I can then bring in one of my trays using this edge to lay that in. So I'm going to leave this in my tray to dry just so the edge is slightly curved inwards just to give our flower a bit of shape. And I'm going to do exactly the same with another petal for the other side. Now for my final set of petals, this is going to be 3 petals that is going to go at the back. Now in the cutter set that I've got this cutter that has the 3 petals joined. Now I actually want to create these as separate petals to give me more control over where they go. Now in some sets you may have a separate petal cutter, which is similar to this one. This one isn't actually an orchid cutter. This is actually from a Casablanca lily set, but it was the closest I could find to it without buying a whole other set. You just want something that's got that kind of distinctive leaf shape. I'm then going to roll out a small amount of gum paste on my veining board as I did with the others. If you are using the joined up petals, place that on, just shape the end into more of a petal shape. Take my smaller rolling pin, stretch out those sides slightly. Now, when you have a look at an orchid with the 3 petals, the one at the top is slightly more rounded, and I do find the 2 that are at the bottom have a slight point to them. So this is going to be one for the bottom. Now it is quite pointed, so I'm just going to bring that down slightly. Go around with my ball tool, dip the end of my wire in some edible glue and just push that into the raised area on the back. I can then use the same veining tool that I have for the rest. Now for the 2 that are going to go on the bottom, I'm going to slightly pinch that end into a point, and using another one of my little dishes, just bring that on the edge just to give it a slight curve. So just pulling that end over the side of my dish. Now I want to do another one of these exactly the same, and for this I'll show you with a single petal cutter. And you want to place it on so the thicker end of the vein is at the bottom of your petal. Now because this is a lily cutter, I'm going to go in and just chop that end off so it just curves round, and then again use my small rolling pin just on the sides of that vein, just pulling out the sides slightly. Run my ball tool around the edge, add in my wire, adding in my vein, and then doing exactly the same things, pulling that end into a point, and just laying this one next to the other one on my dish. Now for the 3rd one, so this is going to be the one that goes at the top. I want this slightly curved. Trim off that bottom bit, take off that point on the top, go in, just soften that with my fingers. So instead of having a point, we've got more of a rounded petal. Again, stretch this out, paying close attention to the bottom. So I want to widen the bottom area on this one. And what this is going to mean is when we add our 2 larger petals in front, you're not going to get any gaps on the side. Now I'm actually going to take this one and flip it over, and with my ball tool just run a small mark just in the top. So just coming down from that point, I'm going to turn it upside down just with the front pointing down to allow that to dry. And this is just going to give some shape to our orchid. So the 2 bottom petals are going to come out slightly and the one at the top is just going to curve over. Once all of our pieces are dry, and I actually left these overnight so that our wires are nice and secure, we've got all 6 pieces. For your petals, you can colour these any colour you like or keep them white. I'm going to add a small amount of pink to mine. I've got the petal dust that I used before. So we've got the combination of the pink, the violet and the rose. Now I've got quite a large fluffy brush, and just coming up from the end, I'm going to put a small amount of colour. I'm then going to take my petals, and where the gum paste ends, just bend that wire back slightly, and on these back ones I'm going to bend it back 90 degrees. Now I'm going to start with my back petals. So I'm going to take all 3 of them. We've got the 2 slightly pointier ones at the bottom and then this slightly rounded one at the top. Take my floral tape, and if you pull on that, it just activates the gum, and just wet the end of the tape. This is going to allow it to stick to itself. Pull it down the whole length of my wires. I'm then going to take my 2 larger ones and I'm going to push these into the gap just under that top petal so that they come together. And then we've got the center of our flower, pull that through. We can now tape all of these together. Now if any of the petals do move, you can just move them back into place once you've wound this all the way down. But there we have our orchid. To add my orchid onto my cake, I'm going to be using some of the small flower picks. So all these do is cover up that tape that we've wrapped the stem in and make it food safe. I'm going to work out how long this needs to be and then trim that off with my wire cutters. I can then push that stem into my flower pick, and then that can be added onto my cake. Now you can add these onto your cake on their own. I'm actually going to make a few orchids so that I can put them together and also show you how to make some buds. So I've taken some of my gum paste and I've coloured this with some of the Colour Splash leaf green. So I've kept it quite light. I'm then going to take a ball of that, and these can be any size. So this one is just over 1 centimetre. I'm going to taper it down on one side, not into a point, so it's quite bulbous. You then want to take the back of your craft knife so it's slightly wider and just work this up 4 times so they join the centre. I've then got a wire, and I'm going to do exactly the same as I did on the first part of my orchid. So to create a little loop, heat that wire up and then push that into the bottom. I can then take some of my floral tape. Now I'm actually going to do this a few times. It's slightly thicker. Then got some slightly darker foliage green tin, and I'm going to use this at the bottom. I'm then going to use a slightly thinner brush, going in with some of that yellow just on those lines, just finishing it off at the top with a small amount of pink. And you can do these in different sizes. So this is quite a large one. So I'm going to do a couple of these, just going down in size. So I've got 3 of my moth orchids, and I've got 3 of those flower buds in 3 different sizes. So I'm going to join all of these together so that I can add them into my cake. Start with the smallest of my flower buds. Now orchids tend to have one big long stem, and the flowers and the buds come off of this. Just bend that out slightly. Take the next size down and just work that flower bud out. Use some of my floral tape to join those 2 together. And I'm going to do exactly the same for the 3rd one. I'm then going to take the first of my orchids and I'm going to bend my wire, so coming in around 1 inch and then bend that down. I'm going to join that orchid down that stem. Now I'm going to take the next one and do exactly the same, so coming in around 1 inch, I'm going to bend that wire. You can keep going down, just adding more and more orchids depending on how you want it to look on your cake. Now I'm going to have these 2 going into the cake, and then the 3rd one I'm going to push into the front. You've then got your orchids that you can add onto your cake. I've just got a 5-inch cake here, which I've coloured in this really dark pink buttercream, and I'm going to take my orchids and just push those in. So here we have the finished moth orchids, which I've used to decorate this really vibrant pink cake. I really hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial and will be able to use it to make your own orchids. If you have enjoyed the video, as always, don't forget to give it a like. Now I will put a list of all the tools that I've used in today's video in the description below so you can find them there. But until next time, bye!